December 22nd, 1944, 11:30 hours, outside Bastogne, Belgium. 4 German officers approached the American perimeter under a white flag, carrying a formal surrender ultimatum from General Heinrich von Lüttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. The message is direct and, by every conventional military calculation available to the Germans that morning, entirely reasonable. The American position is surrounded by 7 German divisions, has no realistic prospect of relief, and is running short of ammunition and supplies. Surrender now with honor or face annihilation by German artillery and armor. The ultimatum reaches Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, who has been napping when his staff wakes him with the demand. He reads it. He looks at his officers. He says one word: nuts. His staff initially treats this as an unguarded first reaction rather than a formal reply. McAuliffe insists otherwise. That is the answer. Send it back exactly as stated. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard types it. Colonel Joseph Harper delivers it personally to the waiting German officers, who ask with apparent genuine confusion what the word means. Harper's explanation, delivered without elaboration, it means the same as go to hell. In plain English, it means no. The German officers reportedly conferred briefly among themselves before departing, apparently uncertain whether they had received a formal military reply at all or simply been dismissed without one. The exchange took less than 2 minutes from delivery to departure, a detail that, on its own, conveys something about how little deliberation McAuliffe's staff felt the ultimatum actually warranted. The word itself is not the interesting part of this story. What is interesting is that von Lüttwitz's ultimatum had correctly assessed every fact about the tactical situation at Bastogne, and had still completely misjudged what the surrounded American force was actually going to do about it. Because the German staff, reasoning from 20 years of European military convention, assumed a surrounded force facing those odds would default to the same response any European army would: hold the perimeter, conserve strength, wait for relief, or for the situation to become unsustainable. The Americans at Bastogne had no intention of merely holding. Throughout the siege, they were attacking. This is the story of where that habit came from. A deliberate institutional choice made 2 decades before Bastogne by a single officer who had watched the First World War destroy good men through indecision and concluded that the next American army would be built to never make that mistake again. The choice traces to a specific institutional appointment on a specific day. September 1st, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland, George Catlett Marshall was sworn in as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. President Roosevelt had passed over 33 more senior generals to select him, a decision that startled the military establishment at the time and that Marshall himself had not actively sought. Marshall's career to that point had been distinguished without being celebrated in the way his contemporaries' careers sometimes were. He had graduated from the Virginia Military Institute rather than West Point, a detail that some of his peers in the small interwar officer corps occasionally noted, and had spent much of the 1920s and 1930s in postings that combined genuine administrative talent with the specific frustration of an officer who believed the institution he served was not preparing adequately for the war he increasingly suspected was coming. He had no public reputation comparable to MacArthur's or even Pershing's by 1939. What he had, demonstrably, was the trust of Roosevelt and a track record, visible to those who had served under him, of producing officers who performed exceptionally once given real responsibility. The army Marshall inherited was, by any honest international comparison, an embarrassment. Roughly 174,000 soldiers, scattered across 130 posts worldwide, ranked 17th globally in size, smaller than the armies of Portugal, Romania, and Spain. Most units operated under strength. Equipment in many cases dated to the First World War. Training emphasized garrison duties and ceremonial function over combined arms maneuver, which was, by 1939, almost entirely absent from the institution's practical experience. Officers spent more of their careers on administrative paperwork than on tactical exercises. Marshall had a specific formative reference point for what he wanted this army to become instead, drawn directly from his own service as a staff officer with the American Expeditionary Forces in France, where he had helped plan the movement of more than 500,000 soldiers for the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest battle in American military history to that point. He had watched, from inside the planning process, talented officers freeze when communications broke down, and the battlefield changed faster than orders could travel up and back down the chain of command. He had watched units take catastrophic frontal casualties, executing plans that had become obsolete the moment the first shots were fired, because no one below a certain rank felt authorized to deviate from them. The institutional fix Marshall settled on had already been tested, years before he became Chief of Staff, in a much smaller laboratory, the United States Army Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he served as Assistant Commandant from November 1927 to June 1932. Fort Benning, under Marshall's tenure, produced an unusually concentrated cohort of future senior commanders. Roughly 200 officers who would go on to general's rank passed through as students or instructors during those 4.5 years, including Omar Bradley, Joseph Stilwell, Matthew Ridgway, and Walter Bedell Smith. What they were taught there was, for American military education at the time, genuinely radical. Marshall stripped away the elaborate, fully specified tactical problems that had previously dominated officer training, exercises that gave students days to study a scenario and craft a comprehensive written solution, and replaced them with deliberately incomplete problems under tight time pressure. His signature innovation was the tactical walk. Officers taken into the field with no advance notice of what they would encounter, stopped at intervals by an instructor who would say, in effect, "Your unit is here. The enemy is reported in that direction. What are your orders?" And then give the officer 5 minutes to assess the terrain and issue verbal orders to an imaginary unit before the walk continued to the next problem. The explicit philosophy behind this, which Marshall stated directly to his instructors, was that officers needed to learn how to think rather than what to think, because real combat would never supply perfect information, adequate time, or ideal conditions, and an officer trained only to execute a fully prepared plan would be useless the moment reality diverged from it, which it reliably would. Evaluation shifted correspondingly. Students who could quote field manual procedures from memory but froze under incomplete information scored poorly. Students who made a defensible decision quickly and executed it cleanly, even imperfectly, scored well. The tactical content of what Marshall taught was as specific as the pedagogical method. He held, based on his own First World War observation, that German forces were at their most vulnerable in the minutes immediately following a successful attack. Disorganized, low on ammunition at the point of penetration, uncertain of the defender's actual remaining strength. An immediate counterattack, launched before the attacker could consolidate, could frequently retake lost ground in minutes at low cost. The same ground, recovered only after a deliberate, properly prepared counterattack hours or days later, cost dramatically more. Because by then, German reinforcements had arrived. Defensive positions were dug, and machine guns were sighted and ranged. Marshall's conclusion was not that boldness was a virtue in the abstract. It was a specific, time-sensitive tactical observation about exactly how fast the cost of recapturing ground increased with delay. This doctrine did not remain confined to Fort Benning. Marshall spent his first 2 years as Chief of Staff doing two things simultaneously: removing officers who could not or would not operate this way, and testing the doctrine at a scale no peacetime exercise had previously attempted. The personnel side was unsentimental. Marshall later estimated he relieved or forced into retirement more than 600 officers, including general officers with decades of service, before American ground forces fired a shot overseas, replacing them with men who shared his orientation toward speed and initiative. George Patton, whose temperament matched the doctrine almost exactly. Dwight Eisenhower, whose particular skill lay in coordinating complex multinational operations rather than in personal aggression on the battlefield. Jacob Devers, who pushed mechanization. Critics inside and outside the Army accused Marshall of gutting an officer corps that had earned its rank through decades of service. Marshall's position was that an officer corps trained for the wrong war was not worth preserving regardless of seniority. The scale test came in 1941, the Louisiana Maneuvers, involving more than 470,000 soldiers across roughly 3,000 square miles of Louisiana and East Texas, the largest peacetime military exercise in American history to that point, opposing two notional armies against each other under realistic combined arms conditions. Marshall attended in person specifically to observe whether the doctrine he had taught at Fort Benning a decade earlier would hold up at the scale of full divisions rather than individual officers walking a training course. The logistical scale of the exercise alone strained the institution it was testing. Local civilians across rural Louisiana found their towns hosting headquarters units and their fields used as bivouac areas for divisions larger than most of the towns themselves. The regional economy absorbed a sudden, temporary influx of military spending and personnel that some local histories from the period describe as transformative in its own right, independent of anything the exercise demonstrated tactically. The maneuvers ran for several months and were divided into multiple distinct phases, each testing different combinations of offensive and defensive scenarios, river crossings, and long-distance rapid movement. It held, with specific exceptions Marshall noted carefully rather than dismissed. Units that counterattacked immediately when struck consistently outperformed units that paused to assess the full situation first. Junior officers who acted on their own initiative, without waiting for direction from higher headquarters, achieved better outcomes than those who held position pending orders. A young tank officer named Dwight Eisenhower, serving with 3rd Army during the exercise, demonstrated how armor could bypass fixed enemy strongpoints entirely and strike directly at rear area command and control, a result Marshall noted and that contributed to Eisenhower's subsequent rapid promotion. George Patton, commanding an armor division, pushed his units beyond the maneuver's prescribed boundaries on the explicit reasoning that real combat would not respect them either. Umpires complained about the rule violations, and Marshall read the same incident as confirmation of exactly the aggressive instinct the doctrine required. The exercise also surfaced genuine institutional weaknesses that Marshall did not paper over. Supply officers repeatedly lost track of fast-moving formations, leaving units stranded without fuel or ammunition. Radio communications between units broke down with enough frequency to be a recognized planning hazard rather than an occasional failure. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was frequently late or simply misdirected. These were treated as solvable engineering and training problems rather than evidence against the underlying tactical concept, and the distinction mattered. Marshall's doctrine survived the Louisiana Maneuver's criticism precisely because its proponents could separate execution failures, which training and equipment could fix, from conceptual failures, which would have required abandoning the approach entirely. The concept, by Marshall's own assessment watching the exercise unfold, was sound. Field Manual 100-5, Operations, published in 1941, codified the doctrine the maneuvers had stress-tested. Offense was stated explicitly as the decisive form of combat, with defense treated as a temporary economizing measure used only to free force for an attack elsewhere, never as an end state to be settled into and maintained. This put American doctrine in a different category from every other major combatant's approach to a unit suddenly under attack. British doctrine, refined across 2 decades from First World War defensive experience, called for establishing a strong defensive position, requesting artillery support, and organizing a deliberate, carefully coordinated counterattack only once the situation had been properly assessed. A process that, by design, consumed hours or occasionally days on the explicit theory that a hasty, uncoordinated counterattack against prepared German positions produced unnecessary casualties for no operational gain. French pre-war doctrine emphasized defense in depth, channeling attackers into prepared killing zones before any counterattack, with methodical, fully prepared operations prioritized over speed. Soviet doctrine called for massive preparatory artillery bombardment and centralized coordination at army level before any large counterstroke, trading speed for overwhelming concentrated force. American doctrine instead placed the decision with whoever was actually in contact, a sergeant, a lieutenant, a captain, and instructed that officer to counterattack immediately with whatever was on hand, without waiting for higher authorization, more complete intelligence, or reinforcement. This was not a claim that the American approach was universally superior. British, French, and Soviet methods each reflected coherent reasoning suited to their own institutional history and resources, and each produced real victories during the war. What the American approach specifically optimized for was speed of response in situations where the cost of delay rose faster than the cost of imperfect coordination, a calculation that happened to match almost exactly the conditions an army with America's particular combination of industrial depth, replaceable materiel, and large reserve manpower could afford to make. Training reflected the doctrine at every level below the field manual. Infantry replacement centers ran 13-week courses built around battle drills explicitly named for offensive responses. React to ambush, assault a fortified position, conduct a hasty attack, clear a building, with no equivalent drill built around holding a static position indefinitely. Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning compressed roughly 4 years of conventional military education into 3 months. Evaluated almost entirely on a candidate's ability to make a workable decision under time pressure with incomplete information, rather than on procedural knowledge. February 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The doctrine's first serious test against a competent enemy, and the first time it produced a result that visibly diverged from what an Allied partner expected. German armor under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel achieved complete tactical surprise against largely untested American units on February 14th, driving them back 50 miles within days. By February 20th, American losses exceeded 6,000, including roughly 3,000 missing or captured, and unit cohesion had broken down across substantial portions of the front. The defeat was, by any measure, severe enough that contemporary British assessments of American combat readiness, already skeptical before Kasserine, hardened into open doubt about whether American forces could be trusted with significant independent responsibility in the North African campaign at all. British observers, working from their own doctrinal assumption about what a defeat of this magnitude required, expected the standard European response: an operational pause to reorganize, absorb replacements, and plan a deliberate counteroffensive, a process British planners assumed would take weeks. It took days. Within 24 hours of the worst fighting, scattered American artillery units were back in firing position, supporting infantry counterattacks. Armor was refueling and rearming for renewed contact. Infantry regiments that had broken were reforming and moving back toward the line, rather than continuing to the rear. By February 22nd, 3 days after the German assault's peak, American counterattacks had halted Rommel's advance. By February 24th, the lost ground had been retaken in full, and German forces withdrew without achieving their operational objective. General Harold Alexander, the British officer who assumed overall theater command in the aftermath, attempted to slow the American recovery down. More training, more methodical preparation before resuming offensive operations. Patton, who took command of 2nd Corps in the same period, told his officers the opposite explicitly. The way to recover from a defeat was to attack immediately, making the enemy worry about what was coming next rather than continuing to dictate the pace himself. Within a month, American forces won at El Guitar, the first clear tactical victory against the Wehrmacht that doctrine had produced under genuinely contested conditions, rather than against the favorable, controlled circumstances of a peacetime exercise. The speed of that recovery, from a defeat severe enough to generate genuine British doubt about American competence to a clear offensive victory in roughly 5 weeks, began within the theater command structure a specific data point that shifted how British and American staffs subsequently planned joint operations together. December 16, 1944, 0530 hours. Germany launches the largest offensive that will mount in the West for the remainder of the war. 30 divisions, roughly 250,000 men, nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, achieving complete tactical surprise along an 85-mile front through the Ardennes, favored by weather that grounded Allied air support entirely. Within 48 hours, German armor had driven a 50-mile bulge into the Allied line, scattering some American units outright and surrounding others. The operational objective, the Meuse River, and beyond it, the vital port of Antwerp, remained genuinely live for those first 2 days. Reaching it would have split the Allied armies and created exactly the kind of negotiating leverage Germany's high command was gambling on. 3 things happened that the German plan had not modeled. Throughout the Ardennes, small, often isolated American units that had been bypassed or surrounded did not withdraw or surrender. They counterattacked locally, at crossroads and villages with whatever they had. Actions that individually accomplished little, but that collectively forced German formations out of efficient road march columns and into deployed combat formations repeatedly, consuming exactly the kind of time the German timetable could not absorb. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, moved entire divisions toward the breakthrough within 24 hours, not to establish a defensive line, but explicitly to counterattack. At a meeting with senior commanders in Verdun on December 19th, Eisenhower opened by characterizing the German breakthrough as an opportunity rather than a disaster. The Germans had left their fortified positions and could now be engaged and destroyed in the open. He asked Patton how quickly Third Army could counterattack. Patton said 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room's silence at that answer reflected a specific, concrete military problem rather than disbelief in Patton's nerve. Third Army was 100 miles south, fully committed to its own offensive toward the Tsar. Redirecting it meant disengaging hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles from active operations, turning the entire army 90 degrees and reattacking on a completely different axis. A maneuver British and German planners independently estimated would require 2 weeks to a month to execute with any operational coherence. Eisenhower gave Patton 72 hours rather than the requested 48. What made this possible was something Eisenhower did not know when he asked the question. Patton had already ordered his staff, before leaving for Verdun, to prepare 3 contingency turn north plans along different axes, anticipating almost exactly this request. When the order came, Third Army's staff was executing a plan already drafted rather than improvising one from nothing, though execution still demanded an entire night of continuous work. Regimental commanders disengaging units still in contact with the enemy, battalion staffs organizing movement orders on the fly, supply officers rerouting logistics chains, artillery batteries displacing north under their own initiative without waiting to be told the specifics. At 0630 on December 22nd, 66 hours after the Verdun meeting, 3 divisions of Third Army attacked north into the German flank, 4th Armored Division leading toward Bastogne. Bastogne sat at the junction of 7 roads converging from every direction the German offensive needed. Holding the town meant holding the regional road network, Losing it meant the German advance could not move the volume of armor and supply the offensive required. Roughly 15,000 American troops, the 101st Airborne Division, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, and supporting units, were surrounded and sided by elements of 7 German divisions, totaling more than 45,000 men, with heavy armor and artillery support. The garrison itself was, in an important sense, an improvised combination rather than a force that had trained together as a single unit. The 101st Airborne had been resting and refitting near Reims after the Netherlands campaign when it received emergency orders to move toward the Ardennes. Combat Command B had been operating independently before being attached to the defense as the situation developed. That 2 formations with no shared chain of command history, coordinated as effectively as they did inside the siege, reflects something specific about the doctrine being described here. Officers at the colonel and lieutenant colonel level were accustomed to integrating unfamiliar units into a coherent tactical picture quickly, because the training pipeline assumed exactly this kind of improvisation would be routine rather than exceptional. The conventional response to those numbers was a defensive perimeter. Conserve ammunition, avoid unnecessary engagement, hold until relief arrived. Bastogne's garrison did not adopt that posture for the length of the siege. When German probes tested the perimeter, the standard response was not simply repelling the attack in place, but counterattacking to push the line back outward and inflict casualties on the withdrawing German troops. When German artillery positions were located, raiding parties went out specifically to destroy them, rather than simply enduring the fire. When German infantry attempted infiltration at night, patrols went out to hunt the infiltrators down before they could regroup. Weather compounded every tactical decision inside the perimeter. Temperatures held well below freezing for most of the siege. Frostbite casualties eventually rivaled combat wounds in some units, and the heavy fog and snow that grounded Allied aircraft for the siege's first several days meant the garrison received no airdrop supply and no close air support during exactly the period when German pressure on the perimeter was heaviest. Medical officers inside Bastogne treated wounded in field conditions with dwindling supplies, performing procedures that post-war accounts describe in terms that make clear how close the garrison's medical situation came to genuine crisis, even as the tactical situation, on the ground, continued to favor aggressive rather than passive defense. On December 23rd, German infantry from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division penetrated the perimeter near the village of Marville on the southeastern edge, a breach that, left unaddressed, would have split the American defense and opened a route for German armor to enter Bastogne directly from the east. Team O'Hara, drawn from Combat Command B and including M4 Shermans, M5 Stuart light tanks, M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, armored infantry, and engineers, counterattacked the penetration immediately without waiting for a fuller assessment of German strength at the breach point. The fighting in Marville was close and room to room. Within 2 hours, American forces had pushed the Germans back and restored the original line. The same pattern repeated across the perimeter in different forms, rather than as a single mechanical repetition of one tactic. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment ran night raids against German positions on the northern sector. The 502nd ran daylight attacks specifically against German artillery observation posts on the west, blinding the fire direction those guns depended on, rather than simply absorbing the shelling. Glider infantry from the 327th ambushed German supply columns on the southern approach roads, attacking the logistics tail, rather than the frontline troops directly opposing them. Each of these actions addressed a different specific problem: a breach, an observation post, a supply route, rather than reapplying an identical template, which is the detail that distinguishes a genuinely decentralized tactical culture from a single tactic mechanically repeated by units that happen to be told to use it. Artillery support inside the perimeter operated with the same decentralization. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, a black unit serving under the still segregated structure of the 1944 Army, fired more than 10,000 rounds during the siege, frequently at danger-close range, close enough that fragments occasionally wounded American troops in forward positions, a risk units accepted deliberately rather than allow German infantry to close unopposed. Battery commanders made independent targeting decisions without routing every fire mission up through a centralized approval chain, allowing artillery to respond to a request from infantry and contact within minutes, rather than the longer cycle a fully centralized system would have required. The battalion's performance at Bastogne, in a still segregated army that routinely denied black artillery units the operational trust given to white units of comparable training, became one of the specific data points post-war advocates for desegregation cited directly in arguing that unit performance under fire bore no relationship to the racial categories the Army's organizational structure still enforced. The corridor that finally reached Bastogne arrived on December 26th, when Lieutenant Charles Bogus's tank platoon from Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, lead tank nicknamed Cobra King, broke through under direct fire at 1650 hours. The opening was only a few hundred yards wide. It was sufficient. By December 27th, the 101st Airborne, which had spent 6 days surrounded under continuous attack, was conducting offensive operations outward to widen the corridor rather than resting inside it, a sequence German commanders later described in post-war interrogation and memoir as specifically bewildering. An encircled force that had just survived a siege should have required time to reorganize before it could attack again. It did not take that time, because the doctrine governing its training had never built in a pause as the expected next step after combat ended. The full Battle of the Bulge concluded by January 25, 1945, 41 days after the German offensive began. German losses ran between 85,000 and 100,000 casualties, alongside tanks, trucks, artillery, and fuel the Wehrmacht in the West never recovered from materially. American losses were also severe. Roughly 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing, nearly 90,000 total. But the line was fully restored, and the German offensive's strategic objective had failed completely. British and Canadian forces operating in the northern sector of the same battle, facing comparable German pressure, generally reverted to their own established doctrine once attacks were repelled: consolidate, assess fully, then mount a deliberate, properly prepared counteroffensive once conditions were judged ready. This was not an inferior approach in any general sense. It reflected the same institutional logic that had governed British operations since the First World War, applied consistently and competently. It was simply slower, by design, trading speed for a different and equally defensible kind of certainty. What German after-action reports from the Western Front recorded, with a consistency that post-war historians studying the captured documents have noted specifically, was less an assessment of any individual American tactic than a description of cumulative exhaustion. American units that lost a position counterattacked before German troops occupying it could dig in. American formations that should, by the conventional timetable, have required days to reorganize after heavy losses, were instead attacking again within hours. German commanders facing the Soviet Red Army on the Eastern Front, by contrast, generally knew when a major offensive was coming. Soviet doctrine massed enormous force for deliberately telegraphed set-piece attacks that could be anticipated, if not stopped, well in advance. German commanders facing the American army in the West frequently could not predict where or when the next attack would land, because American doctrine deliberately distributed the decision to attack down to whichever officer happened to be in contact at the moment an opportunity or a threat appeared. This institutional capacity rested on three specific advantages, and Marshall's doctrine was built deliberately to exploit exactly these three rather than to compensate for their absence. Industrial production sufficient to absorb the ammunition and equipment losses that constant aggressive action consumed at a higher rate than a more conservative approach would have. A population large enough to replace combat losses without the long-term manpower crisis that constrained German and eventually British force generation by 1944. And a training system traceable directly back to the tactical walks at Fort Benning in 1928, that reliably produced officers and NCOs capable of executing complex tactical decisions without waiting for direction to travel up and back down a chain of command that battlefield conditions routinely disrupted. None of the three advantages would have mattered without the other two. Industrial output without a training system that could translate materiel into independent tactical decision-making would simply have produced a better-equipped army still waiting for orders. A large population without the doctrine to use replacements aggressively would have meant more men available to hold the same static lines longer, not more attacks launched faster. The doctrine itself, absent the material and manpower depth to sustain its higher consumption rate, would have been an admirable idea that bankrupted whatever force tried to execute it consistently. The post-war Army's own internal analysis, conducted in the years immediately following Germany's surrender, examined combat performance data across the European campaign, specifically to test whether the aggressive doctrine had actually produced better outcomes or merely higher casualties in the pursuit of speed. The conclusion, reached through comparison of units that had applied the doctrine consistently against units that had, for various reasons of leadership or circumstance, defaulted to more cautious approaches, found that aggressive continuous action had generally achieved its objectives in less time and, in the cumulative tally across multiple campaigns, with lower total casualties than the more methodical alternative would likely have produced over the same operational distance, a finding that surprised some of the officers who had expected the data to show speed purchased at a premium in blood. This is not a claim that holds in every individual engagement. Some specific aggressive actions during the war produced exactly the unnecessary casualties British doctrine worried about. The aggregate pattern across the full campaign favored the doctrine Marshall had built. These conclusions outlived the war that tested them. The doctrine's core principles were carried forward through Korea, where American units facing Chinese mass attacks were trained to counterattack penetrations immediately rather than absorb them passively, and through the institutional memory that shaped American infantry training for decades afterward, embedded in field manuals that, in their structure if not their specific tactical content, still trace recognizably back to what Marshall taught at Fort Benning a century ago. McAuliffe retired a lieutenant general in 1956 and was asked repeatedly across the following decades about the one-word reply that made him briefly famous. His answer was consistently unembellished. The response came naturally because the besieging Germans assumed a surrounded force was thinking about how to survive, and the Americans inside Bastogne were thinking about how to kill more of the men outside the perimeter. That difference in what each side assumed the other was thinking about, not the specific word McAuliffe chose, which was almost incidental to the substance of his answer, is the entire content of what von Lüttwitz's ultimatum failed to anticipate. He had read the map correctly. He had read the doctrine incorrectly, because the doctrine he was reading against did not exist in any other army he had previously fought.